You might have missed these amazing historical photos. Write in the comments, which photo did you like the most? John Conrad Eckert, known as Happy, was an American sideshow performer whose pituitary condition caused his weight to reach about 740 pounds. He performed for more than 50 years, but said his greatest joy was traveling with his wife and 2 children. In 1989, crowds in Beijing gathered around damaged armored vehicles near Tiananmen Square during the final days of the student-led demonstrations. The image captures the scale of public resistance as civilians filled the streets around military equipment. Pyotr Lepenko, pictured on the left with a fellow Kornilov officer in 1920, had escaped Bolshevik captivity the previous year. When white forces withdrew from Yekaterinodar, he remained behind, was detained after the city changed hands, and never returned to his family. On April 9, 1926, Greek strongman Gus Lessis balanced an 800-pound stone across his chest during a public performance in New York City. Known as the human anvil, he remained beneath it while another man broke the stone apart with repeated sledgehammer blows. In 1926, a Chicago housing report found that working families faced rising rents, decaying buildings, and almost no decent new homes. Black and immigrant workers endured the worst conditions, while politicians and developers offered little meaningful action. On February 4, 1923, a group of men in bathing suits gathered at snowy Coney Island and treated the freezing beach like a summer resort. They laughed, posed, and threw handfuls of snow at one another, turning a harsh New York winter day into an unforgettable public spectacle. On June 28, 1922, Irish government forces opened fire on Dublin's Four Courts, where anti-treaty fighters had been holding the complex for months. The siege continued for 2 days before the defenders surrendered, marking the violent beginning of the Irish Civil War. On December 23, 1921, Sarah Doherty posed beside a towering cone-shaped cake covered with candles to celebrate her 100th birthday. Her formal black dress and calm expression make the unusual cake look even more striking in this rare century-old portrait. This 1980s family portrait shows Iraq's ruling household carefully arranged to project unity, wealth, and stability. Several of the children later gained major political and military power, making the cheerful domestic scene a striking contrast to the family's future reputation. In August 1941, German soldiers entered Tallinn after Soviet forces withdrew, and some Estonian civilians welcomed them as liberators. The celebration proved tragically short-lived, as one occupation was soon replaced by another regime of control, persecution, and fear. In 1936, photographer Arthur Rothstein captured a farm mother holding her child outside a rough wooden home in Oneida County, Idaho, during years of severe drought and dust storms. The patched roof, outdoor washer, and bare yard show how families survived with almost nothing while government projects tried to restore the exhausted land. On April 22, 1945, Soviet and Polish troops reached Sachsenhausen and found only about 3,000 prisoners after tens of thousands had been forced onto a march the day before. The camp was later reused by the Soviet secret police until 1950, where thousands more prisoners did not survive. On October 22, 1962, the United States President addressed the nation after secret photographs revealed Soviet missile sites in Cuba. The televised warning began the most dangerous phase of the Cuban Missile Crisis, bringing the world closer to nuclear conflict than ever before. Between 1920 and 1923, orphaned children from regions struck by severe hunger were gathered at railway stations, where aid workers cut their hair before transport and medical checks. Their worn clothes, bare feet, and silent line reveal the enormous crisis that displaced thousands across the former Russian Empire. This portrait shows a Polish community leader about 3 weeks before he died at Auschwitz, wearing prisoner number 35735 and the camp badge on his uniform. His wife's fate remains unknown, but their granddaughter survived, was raised by her older sister and later rebuilt her life in the United States. In the 1920s, a young woman from the Kimshiashvili family posed in traditional bridal clothing in the Ajarian Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic. Her pointed silk covering and layered dress preserve a rare view of wedding customs from Georgia's Black Sea region. In the 1970s and 1980s, women entered Appalachian coal mines in growing numbers, taking underground jobs long reserved for men. They operated heavy equipment, installed roof supports, and worked full shifts in one of America's most demanding industries. About 20 seconds after the Halifax explosion on December 6, 1917, this enormous cloud rose above the harbor after the munition ship Mont Blanc erupted. The blast devastated much of northern Halifax, damaged thousands of buildings, and became one of the largest human-made explosions before the atomic age. On December 27, 1941, British commandos crossed rough surf during the raid on German-held Vagsoy, led by Jack Churchill, who carried a sword and played bagpipes before battle. His fearless style made him one of the war's most unusual officers, and he later escaped captivity and reached Allied lines on foot. In 1952, Dwight Eisenhower became emotional while speaking to veterans and recalling the men who never returned from the D-Day landings he had commanded. The former general paused to wipe his face, revealing the personal weight he still carried 8 years after the invasion of Normandy. In August 1945, thousands packed Times Square after news that Japan had accepted surrender terms, ending the Second World War. People climbed signs, waved flags, and filled every street as New York erupted into one of the largest public celebrations in its history. On December 27, 1900, temperance activist Carrie Nation entered the Carrie Hotel Bar in Wichita and destroyed bottles, mirrors, and furniture in public. The dramatic protest launched her national fame and began a series of raids that made her one of America's most recognizable campaigners against alcohol. During the Second World War, Japanese-American families were removed from their homes and confined in guarded camps across the United States. Even Federal Bureau of Investigation Director John Edgar Hoover opposed mass confinement, arguing that people should be judged by their actions rather than ancestry. On Okinawa in 1945, unarmed medic Desmond Doss was badly injured by a grenade while treating wounded soldiers under fire. Despite his wounds, he gave up his stretcher to another man and later received the Medal of Honor after rescuing an estimated 75 soldiers. On April 20, 1945, United States soldiers climbed the Nazi rally grounds in Nuremberg and raised American flags on Adolf Hitler's final birthday. The image captured the collapse of the regime in one of its most symbolic cities, just 18 days before Germany surrendered in Europe. On February 28, 1940, members of the Navajo, Papago, Apache, and Hopi peoples signed a pledge to stop using the ancient swastika symbol in their art. They abandoned a design used for generations because Nazi Germany had transformed it into a symbol of hatred and oppression. In 1934, British driver Raymond Mays lost a front wheel from his Type 13 Bugatti during the Carefully hill climb in Wales. The car stayed upright and stopped only inches from a steep drop, turning a sudden mechanical failure into an astonishing escape. Around 1900, a family posed proudly outside their newly built wooden home with 2 horses, which were among their most valuable working assets. The wide porch, fenced yard, and formal clothing turned the photograph into a clear statement of stability, progress, and family achievement. Joseph Taborski embraced his mother in 1955 after spending 4 years on death row before his conviction in a 1950 case was overturned. Just over a year later, he was responsible for 5 more deaths, confessed to the original crime, and was executed in 1960. Around 1900, Henry Cyril Paget, the 5th Marquess of Anglesey, posed in one of the spectacular costumes that made him famous across Britain. He spent a vast fortune on theater, jewelry, and elaborate clothing, then died at only 29 after turning his aristocratic life into a dazzling personal performance. In the summer of 1949, Japan National Railways was struck by 3 unexplained disasters in only 6 weeks, including this runaway train at Mitaka Station. The president's mysterious death, the Mitaka crash, and the Matsukawa derailment became known as Japan's 3 great railway mysteries. In 1982, Paula Prince was photographed buying Tylenol at a Chicago Walgreens shortly before becoming one of the victims in the still unsolved tampered medicine case. Investigators focused on a bearded man standing nearby, raising the disturbing possibility that the suspect was captured in the same frame. In 1990, Elton John, Howie Long, and Phil Donahue served as pallbearers at the funeral of 18-year-old Ryan White, who contracted HIV through contaminated treatment for hemophilia. After being rejected by his school and community, he became a national symbol in the fight against fear and misinformation about the disease. In 1949, Marilyn Monroe shared a laugh with Groucho Marx on the set of Love Happy, one of her earliest film appearances. Her brief role lasted only a few minutes, but the publicity around the film helped introduce the future star to a much wider audience. Around 1945, veterans of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade marched through New York City, carrying the flags of the United States and the Spanish Republic. These volunteers had fought against Francisco Franco's forces during the Spanish Civil War, years before the United States entered the Second World War. In 1974, Saddam Hussein toured the Great Mosque of Cordoba with senior officials from Francisco Franco's government during an official visit to Spain. The photograph captures an unusual diplomatic meeting 5 years before Saddam became president of Iraq. In the 1960s, a Soviet MAZ-731O transporter carried an enormous spherical liquid hydrogen tank across the Baikonur Cosmodrome. Built to support the space program, the giant tank towered over nearby vehicles and made the real operation look like a scene from science fiction. In 1990, Robin Williams and Whoopi Goldberg testified before the United States Senate in support of the Homelessness Prevention and Revitalization Act. Using their fame beyond entertainment, they urged lawmakers to expand housing aid and services for people without stable homes. Sometime in the 1980s, an artist stood on the New Jersey waterfront painting Manhattan with the Twin Towers rising above the harbor. His canvas mirrors the skyline behind him, creating a rare photograph of New York being captured from life before the towers disappeared. In 1980, a 71-year-old nun was found lifeless inside a locked chapel, and the carefully arranged scene became one of Ohio's most haunting mysteries. 24 years later, DNA evidence connected a former priest to the case and finally revealed the truth. In January 1969, Harvard graduate student Jane Britton missed an exam and was later found dead inside her Cambridge apartment, leaving investigators with no clear suspect. Nearly 50 years later, DNA evidence identified the man responsible and finally closed one of Harvard's longest unsolved. In 1976, 3 suitcases found near Pennsylvania's Lehigh River held the remains of a young woman and her unborn child, known for decades only as Beth Doe. A strange code written on her palm was the only clue until DNA finally identified her nearly 44 years later. On October 24, 1961, 31-year-old Joan Risch vanished from her Massachusetts home, leaving her infant son alone and her daughter saying that her mother was gone. Investigators found signs of a serious struggle inside, but no confirmed trace of Joan has ever been discovered. In 1997, children in Angola continued their lessons inside a school shattered by years of civil war, sitting at desks among broken concrete and exposed steel. The photograph shows education surviving in a classroom that had lost its walls, roof, and safety, but not its students. In 1965, Helen Mirren played Cleopatra with the National Youth Theatre of Great Britain, years before becoming an internationally celebrated actress. The intense stage performance already showed the commanding presence that would later define her career in film and theater. On April 13, 1948, a medical convoy traveling to Hadassah Hospital on Mount Scopus was attacked near Jerusalem while carrying doctors, nurses, students, patients, and supplies. 78 Jewish passengers and 1 British soldier lost their lives, making it one of the most tragic events of the final weeks of the British Mandate. On August 9, 1945, the atomic bomb Fat Man exploded over Nagasaki, producing this enormous cloud and devastating much of the city within seconds. By the end of the year, an estimated 60,000 to 80,000 people had lost their lives from the immediate effects and radiation exposure. On May 25, 1986, millions of people joined hands across the United States in a symbolic chain stretching through 16 states. Hands Across America raised awareness and funds for hunger, poverty, and homelessness, turning ordinary roads into a nationwide human landmark. This is often described as one of the final photographs of Selena Quintanilla, taken shortly before March 31, 1995. The ordinary scene became haunting after the 23-year-old singer lost her life that day, ending a career that had already transformed Tejano music. In 1948, Palestinian women and children left the coastal village of Tantura under armed supervision after Israeli forces captured it. Many men were separated and detained, while the families were sent away, making this photograph a stark record of the Nakba. This 1990s portrait is often identified as a Tibeto-Mongolian armed man, wearing traditional clothing, prayer beads, ammunition, and carrying a modern rifle. The unusual mix of ancient dress and military equipment reflects the instability that spread across parts of Central Asia after the Soviet Union collapsed. In the 1980s, a Soviet prisoner displayed portraits of Lenin and Stalin across his chest, beside a tiger, a woman, and several smaller symbols. In prison culture, such tattoos acted like a personal biography, revealing loyalty, identity, status, and years spent behind bars. In 1919, these wounded Jewish survivors were photographed after an anti-Semitic pogrom in Khodorkovsk during the Russian Civil War. Across Ukraine, more than 100,000 Jewish civilians lost their lives in similar attacks, making the conflict one of the darkest chapters of the era. During the German siege of Warsaw in September 1939, desperate civilians gathered food from horses left in the streets as attacks cut supply routes and trapped the city. The photograph shows how quickly a modern European capital was pushed into severe hunger and a daily struggle for survival. In April 1941, German air raids left central Belgrade covered in shattered buildings, twisted tramcars, and broken streets during the invasion of Yugoslavia. Civilians returned almost immediately, walking through the ruins of a capital transformed within only a few days. On August 30, 1980, Rachel McLish won the first official Miss Olympia, giving female bodybuilding its own major international championship. Her victory marked a breakthrough for women in the sport and helped turn professional female bodybuilding into a recognized global competition. On May 19, 1962, Marilyn Monroe attended a private New York after-party after singing at President John F. Kennedy's birthday celebration. Still wearing her famous crystal-covered dress, she mingled with powerful political and entertainment figures at the home of Arthur and Matilda Krim. Behind Abraham Lincoln's head on Mount Rushmore lies an unfinished chamber planned as a hall of records for America's most important documents. Work stopped in 1941, but a sealed titanium vault inside now preserves historical texts and details about the monument. In 2005, 19-year-old soldier Lavina Johnson was found dead in her tent in Iraq, and the official investigation ruled her death a suicide. Her family strongly disputed that conclusion, pointing to reported injuries and turning the case into a lasting controversy over what really happened. At the turn of the 20th century, thousands of poor children sold newspapers on American streets, and some began working as young as 4 years old. They had to buy each bundle before selling it, so a slow day could leave them with no profit, while publishers still earned money. In 1943, Varvara Petrovna Virvich, known as Katya, posed at the center of the Dobrush Partisan Brigade in Belarus with an automatic weapon across her arms. At only 21, she served as an underground youth organizer and helped coordinate resistance activity in the occupied Gomel region. In 2000, a Palestinian boy was photographed throwing stones toward an Israeli tank during the early days of the Second Intifada. The dramatic size difference between the child and the armored vehicle turned the image into a powerful symbol of the unequal confrontation unfolding in the streets. Near Springfield, Missouri, a truck carrying about 20 tons of dynamite erupted on Interstate 44 after a rifle shot struck its load. The blast tore a huge crater across the divided highway and scattered debris far into the fields, leaving an almost unreal aerial scene. On May 21, 1988, a mother embraced her son after his Soviet unit crossed the Afghan border and returned to Termez during the military withdrawal. Her tearful relief captured the deeply personal moment when a distant conflict finally ended for one family. In 1959, police in Alberta photographed the shoes of 7 family members after investigators found the oldest son responsible for their deaths. Arranged from the youngest child to the oldest adult, the silent row became one of the case's most haunting records. In 1915, Austro-Hungarian soldiers escorted a Ukrainian peasant through the snow in Galicia after accusing him of spying for Russia. His covered face and the smiling guards create a chilling record of how quickly suspicion near the Eastern Front could become a final sentence. In August 1968, 2 women watched Soviet tanks move toward the Czechoslovak radio building in Prague during the Warsaw Pact invasion. The station continued broadcasting news and calls for resistance, making it one of the most important symbols of public defiance in the occupied city. In 1962, an East German man was detained on suspicion of being a former Auschwitz guard. He admitted to working there, but nothing further. A search of his home uncovered the belongings of people who died in Auschwitz. He had personally selected victims to be gassed and used as human test subjects. On May 17, 1974, coordinated car bombings in Dublin and Monaghan took the lives of 33 civilians and an unborn child, making it the deadliest single day of the Troubles. The attacks were linked to the Ulster Volunteer Force, yet no one has ever been convicted. During the Battle of Tarawa in November 1943, a United States Marine stared into the camera from a damaged position on Betio Island. The 3-day struggle for the tiny atoll became one of the Pacific Campaign's most intense battles and exposed the enormous difficulty of attacking heavily fortified beaches. On May 29, 1985, supporters were crushed against a collapsing wall at Heysel Stadium in Brussels after panic and a sudden crowd surge before the European Cup final. 39 people lost their lives, and the disaster led to major stadium reforms and a 5-year ban on English clubs from European competition. In 1945, Piotr Kemi, a Polish survivor recently freed from a concentration camp, was convicted after a German family that sheltered him was found dead. This photograph shows military police securing him to a post at Landsberg prison, later used for many convicted Nazi officials. On June 24, 1960, Venezuelan President Romulo Betancourt survived a car bomb attack in Caracas that left his hands badly burned. The plot was financed by Dominican ruler Rafael Trujillo, and the international backlash further isolated his regime before its collapse the following year. In 1984, members of East Germany's Free German Youth marched with national flags during the second Polish East German Youth Friendship Day in Szczecin. The carefully staged stadium display promoted socialist unity and turned political loyalty into a colorful mass celebration. In 1979, demonstrators from the National Organization for Women gathered outside St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York to support Iranian women after the Islamic Revolution. Their signs linked a distant political crisis to a growing international movement for women's rights and personal freedom. In 1953, tourists relaxed beside a Las Vegas pool while watching a mushroom cloud rise from a nuclear test about 75 miles away. Hotels promoted the distant flashes as entertainment, turning the city into an unlikely viewing destination during the atomic age. In 1900, Russian military officers posed with guards in Beijing during the Boxer Rebellion, wearing a striking mix of imperial uniforms and traditional headgear. Russia joined an 8-nation alliance that entered the Chinese capital after weeks of fighting and diplomatic crisis. At the Nuremberg doctors' trial, Nazi medical officials faced charges linked to the secret T4 program, which targeted disabled and mentally ill patients years before the death camps. The program also tested centralized gas chambers and procedures later expanded during the Holocaust. In the 1930s, Imperial Japanese Army troops marched beneath the Great Torii Gate of Yasukuni Shrine in Tokyo, while military biplanes crossed overhead in formation. Such ceremonies linked soldiers, state religion, and remembrance, turning the shrine into one of Imperial Japan's most powerful public symbols. In 1939, a photographer looking down on a crowded New York street captured hundreds of people with nearly every head covered by a hat. Hats were then an expected part of public dress, revealing how completely everyday fashion could shape the appearance of an entire city crowd. In 1933, performers at London's Crystal Palace were fitted with wire frames and asbestos suits before a wrestling act promoted as human fireworks. The protective costumes were meant to shield them, while sparks and flames transformed the match into a dramatic public spectacle. In 1909, Felipa Larrea, an Afro-Argentine woman born during slavery, was photographed tending flowers in the garden of her home. Remembered as one of Argentina's last known survivors of the colonial slave era, she lived long enough to witness the country transform after abolition. On July 12, 1943, wounded United States Marines from the 4th Marine Raider Battalion rested aboard a landing craft near Munda Point during the Battle of New Georgia. Dense jungle, constant rain, disease, and stretched supply lines made the advance toward the Japanese airfield brutally slow. In March 1944, this unusual German Ramschauffelpanzer Stug 4 appeared with an enormous armored blade mounted across its front. Built on the Stug 4 chassis, the rare engineering vehicle was designed to push through rubble, clear obstacles, and prepare routes for other armored units. In April 1942, Lieutenant Robert Hite was captured after his Doolittle raid bomber struck targets near Nagoya and crash-landed in Japanese-held China. He endured more than 3 years in captivity and was finally released after Japan surrendered in August 1945. These beaked masks were designed for plague doctors in 17th century Europe, with their long noses packed with herbs and scented materials. People believed the strong aromas could block contaminated air, while the full covering kept doctors at a safer distance from patients. This patient underwent an early reconstructive procedure after losing his nose, with a finger temporarily attached to his face to provide living tissue. Once it healed, surgeons reshaped the tissue into a new nose, revealing how inventive plastic surgery had become long before modern techniques. Inside an abandoned Japanese department store, rows of mannequins in traditional kimonos remained standing long after the customers disappeared. Their cracked faces and frozen poses transformed an ordinary fashion display into an eerie scene preserved from another era. In 1921, Ada Blackjack joined 4 explorers and a cat named Victoria on an expedition to claim remote Wrangel Island in the Arctic. After the others vanished or died, she survived alone for nearly 2 years by trapping animals and maintaining the camp until rescue arrived in 1923. Between 1904 and 1910, photographer Frederick Evans captured the Mari Lwyd procession at Llanginwyd in Wales, led by Ciancower Castell. The winter custom featured a decorated horse skull carried from house to house, where performers traded improvised verses for food, drink, and entry. A group of boys gathered beside a stone monument in a churchyard, dressed in dark jackets and flat caps typical of the early 20th century. Damage to the old photographic plate created pale clouds across the scene, giving an ordinary childhood portrait an unexpectedly ghostly appearance. This early 20th century photograph shows a Koskimo Hamatsa initiate emerging from the forest after spending several days alone as part of a ceremonial initiation. His cedar branches, intense expression, and raised hands represent the powerful supernatural state central to the ritual. During the Dust Bowl of the 1930s, a towering wall of dust approached Stratford, Texas, swallowing the horizon and turning daylight into darkness. Families often had only minutes to seal windows, gather children, and seek shelter before fine soil entered every room. In March 1889, this view from the wrecked USS Trenton shows the USS Vandalia sunk beside her after a powerful cyclone struck Apia Harbor in Samoa. The storm destroyed or disabled several American and German warships, turning the crowded anchorage into a vast field of wreckage. In April 1926, a newborn British princess was photographed in London with her parents, years before her family expected her to inherit the throne. She later became Britain's longest reigning monarch, serving for more than 70 years through enormous political and social change. In 1915, thousands of wine barrels filled a French military camp on Lemnos Island during preparations for the Gallipoli campaign. Wine formed part of the soldiers' daily rations, and this enormous stock reveals the scale of supplies needed to support an army far from home. In 1935, 2 women tested kangaroo jumps, unusual rebound shoes fitted with curved metal springs beneath the soles. Advertised as both exercise equipment and entertainment, they promised higher jumps and faster movement, though simply keeping balance required serious practice. In 1940, the tallest reliably measured person in history stood 2.72 meters tall and weighed about 199 kilograms. His extraordinary growth was caused by a pituitary condition, and he continued growing until his death at only 22, requiring custom clothing, furniture, and reinforced shoes. In the 1940s, a transporter unloaded brand-new Ford cars onto a snowy main street as townspeople gathered outside the dealership. The stacked delivery rig carried several vehicles at once, showing how manufacturers moved new automobiles across America before modern enclosed carriers. In November 1961, 11-year-old Terry Jo Duperolt was rescued after drifting alone for nearly 4 days on a tiny float near the Bahamas. She was the only member of her family to survive the Bluebell tragedy, and her testimony exposed the captain's hidden crime after he claimed to be the sole survivor. In 1914, 4 Texas hunters posed beside a car almost completely covered with quail, revealing how little protection wildlife once received. The photograph was later used in conservation lectures to warn that removing birds which controlled crop pests could damage both farming and local ecosystems. On April 15, 1865, Ford's Theater stood silent one day after the attack on President Abraham Lincoln, while a street poster still advertised the canceled play, The Octoroon. Public anger kept the building from returning to theatrical use for more than a century, with performances finally resuming in 1968. Japanese officers looked down on the wrecked Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1905 after artillery from 203-meter Hill left the harbor filled with sunken battleships and cruisers. Japan later raised several of these ships, repaired them, and placed former enemy vessels into its own navy. Nita Krebs, born in 1905 in Austria-Hungary, became a dancer and entertainer before appearing as one of the Lullaby League Munchkins in The Wizard of Oz. Known for her top hat, tuxedo, and joyful stage presence, she performed for decades and was remembered for her humility and love of life. Residents of Baku welcomed Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev during his 1982 visit, wearing traditional clothing and carrying fruit, bread, and drinks. The carefully arranged ceremony combined Azerbaijani hospitality with the grand public displays used for major state visits in the late Soviet era. Revolutionary War reenactors step out of a New York City taxi in February 1976 while heading to an exhibition for America's bicentennial. The striking scene placed 18th century uniforms, muskets, and polished boots against the traffic and towers of modern Manhattan. The Pamlico thermonuclear test lit the sky above Christmas Island at 6:37 in the morning on July 11, 1962. Detonated 4,370 meters above the Pacific, the 3.88 megaton blast created a glowing fireball and perfectly layered shock rings across the clouds. A group of captured Soviet servicewomen waits beside German soldiers during the opening months of Operation Barbarossa in 1941. German soldiers often marked such photographs with the insulting word Flintenweiber, showing how strongly Nazi propaganda targeted women who served in the Red Army. Dominican ruler Rafael Trujillo ordered the 1937 campaign that targeted thousands of Haitians living near the border. Soldiers reportedly used the Spanish word for parsley to identify people by pronunciation, turning a simple language test into one of the darkest episodes in Caribbean history. On July 5, 1984, Napoli presented its new Argentine superstar at Stadio San Paolo after a world record transfer from Barcelona. As many as 80,000 supporters paid 1,000 lire just to see him enter, while more than 100 photographers crowded around the tunnel. Archer Nancy Gray recreates the famous William Tell stunt, aiming at an apple balanced on her friend's head during a beach demonstration. With no visible protection and almost no room for error, the photograph captures the daring showmanship once used to amaze live audiences. 3 visibly nervous volunteers sit beneath an experimental shaving machine designed to move razors across several faces at the same time. The invention promised a faster alternative to the barber, but their tense expressions show why few people were eager to trust a machine with such delicate work. Japanese officers overlooked the ruined Russian fleet at Port Arthur in 1905 after heavy artillery from 203-meter hill struck ships trapped inside the harbor. Several of these vessels were later raised, repaired, and placed into the Japanese Navy as captured warships. In 1925, 4 jazz musicians crowded around a row of babies and played brass instruments at extremely close range for a staged photograph. The children's startled faces turned the strange studio scene into an unforgettable image of early jazz meeting an audience far too young to ask for an encore. Performer Charlie Boehm stands beneath a towering spiral of chairs balanced on his head during a remarkable live act. With no visible support and the audience watching from only a few meters away, the stunt demanded extraordinary strength, control, and perfect timing. A very well-fed dog sits beside a handwritten sign explaining that he cannot refuse a meal and asking strangers not to offer him food. The owner had clearly learned that one friendly face could collect far too many snacks from generous visitors passing the bench. A pet store employee relaxes beneath a lively crowd of white mice climbing across her clothes, shoulders, and even her hair. Her calm smile makes the unusual scene look almost ordinary, despite being completely surrounded by dozens of tiny animals. Workers transfer Soviet oil between rail tankers at Przemysl on February 29, 1940, before it continued toward Germany. The cargo required different cars because Soviet and European railways used different track widths, turning the border into a vital supply point. Japanese schoolgirls practice with bamboo spears during the final months of the Second World War, when civilians were prepared for a possible Allied invasion. With firearms in short supply, students learned basic drills and were expected to defend their towns with improvised weapons. At Springfield House School in London in 1932, children receiving treatment for tuberculosis rest outdoors in neat rows beneath heavy blankets. Before effective antibiotics, fresh air and sunlight were considered essential. So many schools and sanatoriums moved recovery periods outside. On March 27, 1999, a Yugoslav air defense unit brought down an American F-117 Nighthawk near Bujanovci, proving the famous stealth aircraft was not invisible. Local residents later climbed onto the recovered wing and danced on it, creating one of the most memorable images of the NATO campaign. A Soviet soldier photographed this wall in Czechoslovakia during the Warsaw Pact invasion of 1968. The message reads, "USSR, go home, enemies," capturing the anger of civilians as tanks and troops entered the country to crush the Prague Spring reforms. In 1932, this woman tested illuminated reading glasses fitted with tiny lamps powered by a small battery pack beside her. The unusual device allowed reading in darkness without lighting the entire room, but its wires and weight kept it from becoming an everyday accessory. The former Central Committee Tower in Belgrade burns after a NATO airstrike during the Kosovo conflict in 1999, sending thick smoke across the city skyline. Although several upper floors were badly damaged, the structure survived and was later rebuilt into a modern office and shopping complex. Romanian army tanks occupy central Bucharest during the Revolution of December 1989, as huge crowds filled the streets and Nicolae Ceausescu's government rapidly lost control. Within days, the communist regime collapsed, ending more than 2 decades of his rule and changing Romania forever. At an international tobacco exhibition around 1930, a ballerina poses between 2 enormous novelty cigars created to draw attention to the display. Their absurd size transformed an ordinary trade show promotion into one of the strangest publicity photographs of the era. A strong man lies beneath a heavy stone, while 2 assistants swing sledgehammers to break it across his chest during a public stunt. The act depended on careful placement, timing, and body control, because one misplaced strike could turn the dramatic performance into a disaster. On May 17, 1934, a young student proudly posed beside a chalkboard caricature labeled "Teacher," turning an ordinary classroom into a playful photo opportunity. Her bold drawing and mischievous expression preserved a rare, humorous glimpse of school life nearly a century ago. Write in the comments, which photo did you like?